The blizzard came without warning and without mercy. It rolled down from the northern peaks like a living thing, consuming the mountain road inch by inch until the road simply ceased to exist beneath layers of driving white. The pine trees that lined the cliffs bent so deeply they nearly kissed the ground. Boulders that had stood unmoved for centuries vanished beneath snowdrifts. The wind screamed through every crack and hollow in the mountain face, a sound so constant and so violent that it stopped sounding like wind at all and started sounding like something that wanted to be heard. Nothing should have been out in it. And yet, in the suffocating heart of that storm, anchored to the frozen earth by iron stakes driven deep into the rock beneath the snow, were two dragons. They were young, not the towering, mountain-sized creatures of old stories, but unmistakably, undeniably dragons. One was the deep, dark blue of water under a moonless sky, his scales carrying the faint iridescence of something that belonged in open air and wide valleys. The other was silver-white, almost luminous even in the gray fury of the storm, her scales catching what little light the blizzard allowed and throwing it back cold and sharp. They were curled against each other in the road, wings pinned by iron harnesses, necks collared, ankles shackled with chains so thick and heavy they seemed built for something far larger. Someone had spent considerable money making sure these two creatures could not fly, could not run, could not do anything but remain exactly where they had been placed. And they had been placed here deliberately. The men who left them were already warm in a lowland tavern, splitting a payment that felt generous for so little effort. They had taken the dragons from a quiet valley 3 weeks ago while they slept, caged them, sold them twice over, and when the last buyer grew tired of the responsibility, the simplest solution had been the mountain road and a bee. Soren had fought for a long time before he stopped. He was not the kind of creature who surrendered easily, even chained. Even starving, even with the cold working its way into his bones like something patient and permanent. He had scraped his claws against the frozen stone beneath him until the rock was gouged and his claws were raw and bleeding. He had pulled against the collar until the iron left marks in the scales around his neck. He had tried every angle the chains allowed, tested every link, searched for any weakness in the stakes driven into the earth beneath the snow. He had done everything a creature with his strength and his stubbornness could do. And then, somewhere in the long, grinding middle of the storm, he had simply stopped, not because he gave up exactly, more because the cold had reached a depth in him where the signals his body sent no longer translated into movement. His legs refused. His wings, pinned as they were, had gone from aching to numb to something beyond numb that had no good name. He laid his great dark head down against the frozen ground and let his bleeding claws press flat against the stone, and the fight went out of him the way fire goes out, not all at once, but in stages, each one quieter than the last. Ice found him quickly after that. It crept along the ridges of his spine with the slow, unhurried confidence of something that knew it had time. It built in the grooves between his scales, gathered in the hollows behind his shoulders, traced the line of his jaw where it rested against the snow. It did not rush. It simply accumulated. And the way cold always does when warmth stops pushing back, claiming him degree by degree like a debt being collected. His breathing slowed. His heartbeat followed. Lyra felt every change against her own body where they pressed together, and she cataloged each one with the focused attention of someone refusing to look away from a thing simply because it was terrible to watch. She ate. Lyra had memorized her brother's heartbeat the way some creatures memorize the sound of water or wind. She had known it her entire life. From the shell, some said, that twins began to know each other before the world had even properly introduced itself. Soren's heartbeat had always been steady and deep, a slow, reliable drumming that she had slept beside and flown beside and felt against her scales through every cold night since they were small enough to curl together in a space no bigger than a cartwheel. She knew its rhythm the way she knew her own breathing. She knew what it sounded like when he was asleep, when he was angry, when he was frightened, when he was simply alive and well and present beside her. She knew what it was supposed to sound like, and she knew with a certainty that sat in her chest like a swallowed stone that what she was feeling now was not that. It was slower. Noticeably, undeniably slower than it had been yesterday, and yesterday it had already been slower than the day before. Each beat came with a pause after it that stretched a fraction longer than it should, as if his heart was considering whether the next one was worth the effort. She pressed herself harder against his side, flattening every scale she could manage against his body, pushing whatever warmth she still carried in her core outward through the contact between them. She had been doing this for hours. She would keep doing it for as many hours as remained. It wasn't much warmth. She knew that too. The cold had taken most of what she had to give long before now, and what remained was less a source of heat than a memory of one, enough to matter maybe at the margins, but not enough to turn anything around. She gave it anyway. There was nothing else to give, and she was not the kind of creature who kept things back when her brother needed them. The chains made everything harder. They were everywhere, across her shoulders, around her ankles, pulling at the H. 3 weeks ago, the valley had been quiet. It was the kind of quiet that belonged to places untouched by roads or trade routes, or the particular human habit of turning wilderness into something useful. A deep valley tucked between two mountain shoulders, fed by a cold river that ran clear even in the heart of winter, sheltered by tree lines so old and dense that the wind barely reached the floor. Their mother had chosen it carefully, the way dragons choose everything, slowly, thoroughly, with the long patience of creatures who understand that a decision made once may need to last a century. Soren and Lyra had been sleeping when the hunters came. They never heard the approach. The men knew their work and had done it before. They came in the early hours with equipment built for exactly this purpose. Nets woven through with iron thread, poles for leverage, sedatives derived from plants that even a dragon's body couldn't process quickly enough to matter. By the time Lyra's eyes opened, the net was already closing and the sedative was already in her blood, and the valley, the quiet, beautiful valley, was tilting sideways and going dark. Their mother had not been there. That was the detail Lyra returned to, in the long, empty hours of captivity, more than any other. Not the hunters, not the chains, not the cages they woke in, but the simple fact that their mother had been gone from the valley that morning, and that somewhere in the world she did not yet know what had happened, and perhaps was still looking. The hunters sold them within a week. The cargo was cargo, and they had a buyer already arranged. A noble in the lowland city who collected rare things the way other men collected debts, casually and without particular attachment. He had been pleased with them for perhaps a fortnight, showing them to guests the way he showed off imported furniture or unusual weapons, a conversation piece with scales and teeth. Then the novelty wore off, as novelty always. Lyra saw it first because she was the only one still looking. The storm had been the same for so long, the same white fury, the same howling dark, the same wall of nothing in every direction, that her eyes had stopped expecting anything different from it. She was watching out of stubbornness now, not hope. Watching because it was the last defiance available to her, not because she believed the watching would produce anything worth seeing. And then, in the deep white chaos somewhere down the road, there was a light. It was small, almost nothing, a pale, warm smear in all that gray and white, the kind of thing her exhausted eyes could have invented entirely. She stared at it without moving, without reacting, simply confirming that it was real before she allowed herself to respond to it. It swung in a slow, pendulum rhythm, aber side to side, the unmistakable movement of something carried by a walking body. Someone was out in the storm. Someone was on the road. Someone was coming toward them. The growl built in her throat before she made any conscious decision about it. It was old and automatic, written into her body by 3 weeks of hands that grabbed and caged and chained. The sound her body made when it registered human presence before her mind had fully processed anything else. Her lip pulled back from her teeth, pale and sharp in the dark, and she raised her head from Soren's neck for the first time in hours, despite the effort it cost her. Every memory she owned of humans could be sorted into the same category: the hunters in the valley, the handlers in the cages, and the noble's guests who leaned too close and spoke too loudly and pointed at her like she was a painting hung crooked on a wall. The men who drove the iron stakes into the mountain rock while she was still too sedated to do anything but watch. Hands and chains, and the smell of iron and the sound of locks closing. That was the full sum of what humans had ever been to her. The light Kepu, his name was Edron, and he had been walking for 6 hours. He was 31 years old, lean in the way that people who move for a living become lean, with hands that were permanently rough from rope and weather, and the particular kind of work that doesn't care about conditions. He carried a courier pack that weighed slightly more than it should have because he had accepted 2 extra parcels that morning from a merchant who paid well and apologized poorly. And he had been regretting that decision since approximately the 2nd hour, when the sky had begun doing things that suggested the weather reports he'd been given were optimistic to the point of fiction. He was 3 hours late to a delivery in the lowland city on the other side of the mountain pass. 3 hours late meant a penalty clause. A penalty clause on top of the delayed payment he was already absorbing from last month meant a very specific kind of winter, the kind where every purchase required a separate internal conversation about necessity. He had done the arithmetic twice while walking, and it had not improved either time. He needed this delivery. He needed to be moving and not stopping, and certainly not standing in the middle of a mountain road in a blizzard doing anything other than putting one foot in front of the other until the pass was behind him. He rounded the bend with his head down and his coat pulled to his ears and walked directly into the edge of his lantern light, falling across something that his mind refused to process for a full 2 seconds. Then his boots found the snowdrift and he sat down in it hard. Like he held the lantern up with the instinct of a man protecting his only light source and stared at what the storm had been hiding in the middle of the road. Scales, chains, 2 shapes pressed together in the snow, one dark blue and one silver white, and the pale gleam of eyes catching his light and throwing it back with the particular quality that no ordinary animal's eyes. Edron did not rush. That was the first thing Lyra noticed about him, the deliberate, unhurried way he closed the distance between them, each step placed with the careful intention of someone who understood that speed was a form of aggression and had decided against it. He stopped a few feet from her and crouched down in the snow, bringing himself below her eye level, and she understood instinctively that this too was intentional. Every handler she had ever encountered had stood above her, used height the way they used chains, as a reminder of the arrangement between them. This man made himself small in the snow and looked at the chains with the focused, practical attention of someone taking inventory of a problem. He was not looking at her the way the noble's guests had looked at her. He was looking at the iron. His voice came out quiet and low when he started talking, shaped into the particular tone that has no sharp edges, not commanding, not pleading, not performing reassurance in the hollow way that made her skin tighten. It was simply a voice filling space, words that arrived without demands attached to them. He said something about the storm, something about the road. She didn't follow all of it, and she suspected he knew she didn't need to, that the words themselves were less important than the steadiness of them, the proof that he could speak without it meaning something was about to get worse. Her growl had died somewhere in the last few minutes. She wasn't sure exactly when. It had simply become unsustainable, too much effort for a body running on too little. And something about the rhythm of his voice made the muscles that produced it slowly unknot. She kept her teeth visible for a while longer out of something closer to habit than intention, and then that too faded, and she was simply watching him with her pale gold eyes while he examined the first lock with the focused squint of a man who has opened difficult things before. She'd die. The locks were not going to make this easy. Edren had known that from the first moment his tool found the keyhole and felt the resistance of metal that had been sitting in deep cold for long enough to forget it was supposed to move. The mechanisms were quality work, not the cheap iron used on livestock gates or storage rooms, but the precise, expensive kind built by someone who understood that what they were containing mattered and that ordinary locks would not be sufficient. Each tumbler was tight and deliberate, and the cold had compressed everything inward until the tolerances that a key would have navigated easily were now barely tolerances at all. He worked with the patience of someone who had learned early that frustration was a tool that broke more things than it fixed. His fingers went numb the first time around the second lock. He pressed them flat against his chest under his coat for 2 minutes, breathing deliberately, waiting for sensation to return with the pins and needles' persistence that meant they were functional again. Then he went back. The storm did not pause for this. The wind came off the peaks in long, sustained pushes that found every gap in his coat with the thoroughness of something that had been practicing, and the snow drove horizontally past his lantern in curtains that reduced visibility to almost nothing beyond the small circle of gold light he was working inside. He talked because silence made everything feel more precarious. It started with the storm itself. Practical observations, the kind that required no response and expected none. Just the shape of a human voice doing what human voices do when they are trying to signal that they are not a threat. Then the road and the peculiarities of mountain passes in winter. And a merchant he had met once at a way station who had claimed the northern pass was safe in any weather and had clearly never actually attempted it. Small things, unimportant things. The verbal equivalent. The collar came off with a sound like a held breath finally released. It hit the snow beside her, and Lyra went completely, absolutely still, stiller than she had been even in the worst hours of the storm, stiller than exhaustion or cold had made her. She did not move her head. She did not stretch her neck or test the new absence of weight, or do any of the things that freedom from a long constraint should naturally produce. She simply stopped. Every muscle locked in place, as if movement itself had become something that required new permission she hadn't yet figured out how to grant herself. Edren sat back slightly and gave her the stillness without comment. He understood, in the practical way of someone who had spent years reading the body language of creatures in difficult situations, that what he was looking at was not calm. It was the particular frozen quality of a thing that has been defined by a pressure for so long that the removal of the pressure doesn't feel like relief. It feels like wrongness, like a missing wall that the body keeps bracing against out of memory. The collar had been on her neck for 3 weeks. Her muscles had learned to carry it. Her posture had organized itself around it. And now it was gone, and her body didn't know what that meant yet. He moved to her ankles without rushing and without drawing attention to the moment more than it needed. The first ankle shackle was the heaviest, a thick iron ring with a locking mechanism on the outer face that his tools found more cooperative than the collar had been, loosened perhaps by the body heat that had conducted down through her leg despite the cold. It opened with a resistance and then a give, and he lifted it carefully away from her scale and set it in the snow with deliberate quietness, as if the sound of it landing mattered. Lyra trembled. It was fine and continuous, barely visible, the kind of trembling that lives deep in muscle rather than on the surface. The Phi. Soren's chains told a different story. Edren moved to the dark blue dragon carefully, announcing his approach with the same low, steady voice he had used throughout, giving Soren's half-conscious awareness time to register him as the same presence that had been working quietly in the storm for the past hour, rather than something new and threatening. Soren's dark amber eyes tracked him slowly, fever-bright and unfocused, but tracking, which meant something was still working behind them, which meant there was still time. He found the first lock and his heart sank slightly. The cold had done something to these mechanisms that went beyond the ordinary stubbornness he had dealt with on Lyra's chains. With 3 weeks of freezing temperatures cycling through the mountain's daily rhythms, had worked moisture into the internal components and frozen it there repeatedly until the tumblers were not merely stiff, but essentially fused. The metal contracted so completely around itself that the space a key or tool needed to operate in had simply ceased to exist. He tried his primary tool and felt nothing move. He tried his secondary and achieved the same result. He worked at it for several minutes with the focused persistence of someone who does not accept a conclusion until they have tested every available avenue, and at the end of those minutes he sat back in the snow and looked at the lock with the expression of a man having an honest conversation with a limitation. His tools were not going to be enough, and he was still working through what that meant. Whether there was an approach he hadn't tried, whether the stakes themselves could be addressed instead of the locks, whether any of the other equipment in his pack offered something useful. When he felt the air beside him change. Lyra moved forward. She had been still since the last of her own chains came off, sitting in the recovery of her own freedom with the careful attention of something relearning itself. And the last chain hit the snow, and the silence that followed felt enormous. Not the silence of the storm. The storm had not paused for any of this and was not pausing now, but a silence underneath the storm, in the small circle of lantern light where 3 beings sat in the snow, and the work that had consumed the last hour was suddenly, completely finished. Edrin lowered his tool. Lyra sat back. And Soren, as if the final chain had been the last thing holding him below the surface, opened his eyes. Not the half-open, fever-glazed tracking that Edrin had seen while working, fully open, dark amber irises wide and present, catching the lantern light and holding it with the particular quality that distinguished a conscious gaze from a merely functional one. And they were bright with the brightness that deep cold and long hunger produce in a body fighting to maintain itself, a feverish luminance that was not health, but was not absence either. Confused, deeply, visibly confused, the expression of a creature returning to awareness in circumstances it had no framework to explain, but alive. Undeniably, stubbornly, against what the mountain had intended. Alive. Edrin looked at him for a moment, and then did the only practical thing left to do. He pulled his pack across the snow toward him, and opened it, and took out everything he had brought for the road. Dried meat wrapped in cloth, a portion of hard cheese that had survived the cold better than he had, twice-baked bread dense enough to have lasted 3 days of travel without deteriorating. And he laid it all out in the snow between himself and the 2 dragons, with the straightforward manner of someone presenting facts rather than making an offering. He looked at them both and said it plainly. That it wasn't enough, that he knew it wasn't enough. That 3 weeks of starvation in a mountain blizzard was not something a courier's travel provisions could meaningfully address. But it was what he had. Every last piece. Nobody asked her to do it. There was no gesture from Edran, no shivering performance designed to communicate need, no moment where he looked at her with expectation. He had pulled his coat tighter against the wind with the resigned practicality of a man who had accepted that he was going to be cold for the foreseeable future and was managing accordingly. He had done what he came to do, or rather, what he had decided to do in that unplanned moment of setting his pack in the snow. And now he was simply present in the aftermath of it, sitting in the blizzard with the quiet stillness of someone who has spent all his immediate resources and is waiting for his body to tell him what comes next. Lyra watched him for a long moment. She watched the way the wind found him, the specific northwest angle of the worst gusts coming off the upper peak, the way they hit him broadside and drove through the wool of his coat with the efficiency of something that had been practicing on this particular stretch of road for a very long time. She watched him tighten his shoulders against it in the involuntary flinch of a body that is cold enough that cold has stopped being a condition and started being a conversation it cannot stop having. She watched his breath come out in short clouds that the wind immediately destroyed. Then she stood up. She moved with the slow deliberateness that had become her way of moving around him. Every action telegraphed, every shift of her weight announced by its own approach, nothing sudden, nothing that could be read as threat. She turned herself and walked a half-circle through the snow and positioned her body between Edrin and the northwest, folding herself into a curve that maximized the surface area she was placing between him and the wind's worst angle. The effect was immediate. The howling dropped to a murmur on his side of her. The driven snow that had been finding every gap in his coat simply stopped arriving. The air in the small. The storm died the way storms die on mountains. Not gradually, not with the slow, polite recession of lowland weather, but all at once, as if something had simply decided it was finished. Adrian became aware of the change before he was fully awake. The sound was the first thing, or rather the absence of sound, the sudden removal of the constant roaring that had been the backdrop of everything for so many hours that his sleeping mind had incorporated it as a permanent condition of the world. When it stopped, the quiet was so complete and so sudden that it pulled him upward out of sleep, with the confused urgency of a man who has been warned to listen for a signal and wakes uncertain whether he just heard it. He opened his eyes. The mountain road lay before him, blazing and remade, and every surface covered in the clean, undisturbed white of fresh snow that the wind hadn't yet touched, the kind of white that has a bluish quality in the early light and makes the eye work harder than expected because there are no shadows yet to give it depth. The sky above the peaks was the sharp, saturated blue that only exists in the hour after a serious storm has cleared. A color so definite and unambiguous, it looked almost constructed. The sun was not yet above the highest ridge, but its light was already there, arriving ahead of it, turning the snow on the upper slopes into something that required squinting. It was very cold and absolutely still and almost unbearably clean-looking. Raedran sat up slowly and worked the stiffness through his back, with the wincing patience of a man in his 30s who has slept on frozen ground and is doing the accounting on that decision. He registered warmth still at his back. Lyra had not moved from her position through the night. The steady banked heat of her still present in the air around him, a small, reliable weather system that had outlasted the storm entirely. He turned to check on Soren. The change was profound enough that he stopped. He kept it practical because practical was what he knew how to do. He stood up from the snow and shouldered his repacked pack and took stock of the road ahead with the assessing squint of someone calculating distance and daylight and the specific arithmetic of how late was too late to salvage a situation. The pass was still crossable. The storm had left deep snow, but the wind had scoured the worst of it from the upper road, and the sky had the hard, clear quality that suggested at least a day before the next system came down from the northern peaks. One day was enough. One day was what he needed. He turned to the twins. They were both watching him with the particular focused attention they seemed to share as a trait, that steady, measuring quality that made being looked at by them feel like being read rather than simply seen. Now, Soren was sitting upright now, still carrying the evidence of 3 weeks of starvation in the lean lines of his body, but upright and present and tracking the world with clear amber eyes that had none of last night's fever in them. Lyra sat beside him, her silver-white scales catching the morning light and doing something extraordinary with it, her pale gold eyes on Edrin with an expression he had been trying to categorize since the previous night and still couldn't quite place. He said what made sense to say. He told them the next storm would come within a day, maybe less if the upper peaks were reading the way he thought they were reading. He told them south was warmer and the southern valleys were remote enough that they were unlikely to encounter the kind of human traffic that led to hunters with iron nets. And he told them they were free and the road was clear and everything that had needed doing had been done. He said it plainly and without sentiment because sentiment would not help them navigate south and plain information might. Then he gave them the nod. It was a specific nod, not the perfunctory acknowledgement he gave.